What if Jesus' crucifixion hadn't just been the execution of a man condemned by the power of Rome? What if, behind the authorities, the soldiers, the accusations, and the crowd, there existed a much deeper conflict? A conflict between light and the forces that keep humanity trapped in fear, ignorance, and illusion? What if those who thought they were silencing Jesus had made the biggest mistake in all of spiritual history? Because maybe they looked at the cross and saw victory. Perhaps they saw an immobilized body, scattered disciples, and a voice that would finally stop bothering them. But they didn't realize that, at that very moment, the cross was going from being the symbol of their authority to becoming the revelation of their defeat. There is an ancient question that spans the centuries and continues to disturb those who approach the mysteries of early Christianity. Who really crucified Jesus? The historical answer seems known. Rome authorized the condemnation. Pontius Pilate represented imperial power. Religious leaders participated in the accusation. Soldiers carried out the sentence. A crowd was manipulated. All this belongs to the visible side of events. But some ancient spiritual currents believed that, behind human structures, invisible powers acted. Powers that not only appear as creatures hidden in distant regions of the universe, but also as forces of dominance, ignorance, arrogance, and separation. In the language of certain Gnostic traditions, these powers were called Archons. The word means rulers, dominators, or authorities. They would be forces that administered the lower world, keeping the human soul distracted from its divine origin. For this view, the greatest power of the Archons was not in physical violence. I was in ignorance. They dominated because human beings had forgotten who they were, where they came from, and where they should return. And perhaps it is precisely here that the title of this video reveals its strength. The Archons would have participated in Jesus' crucifixion without truly understanding who he was. They saw him as just a threat to the system, a dangerous man, a master who should be eliminated, a presence that needed to be erased before it woke up too many people. However, while they planned to destroy their mission, they ended up turning the cross into the place where the true nature of the power would be exposed. Think about it for a few seconds. Common power believes that it wins when it manages to hurt. He believes he triumphs when he silences a voice. He believes he dominates when he provokes fear. He believes he controls when he forces someone to bow. But Jesus did not respond to power with the weapons of power. He did not become what he fought. He didn't return hate for hate. He did not allow the violence of his enemies to produce within him the same darkness that existed within them. And that was exactly why the cross began to change its meaning. The cross had been created to humiliate. It was a public message from Rome. He said that no one should challenge the empire. It said that the human body could be used as a warning. He said that the authority of the world had the final word. However, after Jesus, what should have produced shame began to inspire hope. That which should erase his memory spread its message. What was supposed to prove its weakness began to reveal a different strength, a strength that the empire could not understand. This is the first great irony of the crucifixion. The powers decided to raise Jesus before everyone as a defeated man, but ended up placing his message at the center of the story. They tried to turn him into an example of failure, but his image crossed peoples, languages, cultures, and generations. They wanted to make the cross an end point, but it became a door. Perhaps the Archons, within this spiritual interpretation, understood many things about the world, but they did not understand love. They knew strength, but they did not know surrender. They knew control, but they did not know inner freedom. They knew how to awaken fear, but they did not understand a soul that was no longer governed by fear. They knew how to threaten death, but they didn't know what to do in the face of someone who trusted completely in the Father. There is a passage attributed to the Apostle Paul that seems to touch on exactly this mystery. He talks about a wisdom that the rulers of this world have not understood. And he states that if they had understood, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. This sentence is impressive. She suggests that crucifixion was also born out of blindness. Rulers believed they understood what they were doing, but they did not understand the profound result of their own actions. They knew they were condemning Jesus, but they didn't know what the cross would become. They knew they were trying to eliminate a master, but they didn't know that their message would be multiplied. They knew they were closing a tomb. They did not know that that tomb would become a testimony that death did not have the last word. They knew how to control bodies, but they didn't know how to imprison a truth that had already awakened within thousands of hearts. It is important to understand that the idea of archons does not need to be presented simply as a narrative about invisible beings. It can also be understood as a spiritual language to explain everything that dominates human consciousness. An archon can represent the fear that makes you forget your dignity. It can represent guilt used to control people. It can represent the pride that makes someone believe they are superior to others. It may represent religious systems that speak of God, but prevent people from approaching Him. It can represent political structures that promise security while fueling anxiety and division. When we look at it this way, we realize that Jesus' crucifixion didn't happen just because some people were cruel. It occurred because its presence exposed structures that survived from the separation. Jesus brought people together who should have remained apart. He sat with those who were considered unworthy. He touched the excluded. He talked to people who society despised. He forgave those who carried guilt. He taught that the kingdom of God did not belong only to the powerful, the rich, or those recognized by institutions. Jesus said with words and attitudes that God was closer than everyone imagined, and that was dangerous for any system that depended on the idea of distance. A control system needs to convince you that you cannot meet God without His permission. It needs to make you believe that you are not worthy of approaching the Father. It needs to keep your conscience stuck in the feeling of incapacity. The more distant you feel from God, the more easily you accept intermediaries who want to control your faith. But Jesus crossed these barriers. He spoke of the Father in an intimate way. He taught people to pray without a spectacle. He said that the Father saw in secret. It showed that mercy was above condemnation. It revealed that the Sabbath should serve human beings and not for human beings to become slaves to empty rules. In each teaching, He removed a stone from the inner prison. This was what the powers could not tolerate. Jesus did not need to organize an army to threaten the system. An awakened person already represents a threat to the entire fear-based structure. A person who discovers his dignity stops accepting certain chains. A person who finds the Father in secret stops being easily manipulated by appearances. A person who learns to love does not react in the way dominant people expect. The archons in this reading depended on a sleeping humanity. They needed men to believe that they were just matter, just fear, just desire, just survival. They needed people to compete against each other, as if God's light were a limited resource. They needed each human being to see others as enemies. Because where there is division, control strengthens. Then Jesus appears speaking of unity. It comes from teaching that whoever wants to be the greatest must serve. It appears saying to love your enemies. It arises by placing a child at the center. It appears revealing that the humble, the merciful, the peacemakers, and the pure of heart are closer to the truth than those who display titles and power. This message was simply not pretty. It was revolutionary. She dismantled the logic of the dominators. If you love those who hate you, they cannot determine who you will become. If you forgive, they can't keep your heart chained to the past. If you serve out of love, they cannot use pride to control you. If you find God within the silence, they cannot convince you that truth depends on spectacle. If you lose your fear of death, what threat can still enslave you? Perhaps this was the Archons' most profound defeat. It was not a defeat similar to a human battle, in which one army destroys the other. It was a significant defeat. Their main weapon was the fear of death. The cross represented the maximum point of this fear. But Jesus crossed the cross without allowing His essence to be governed by terror. When a weapon stops producing the desired effect, it loses part of its power. The rulers wanted the cross to say, "The empire has won," but the Father turned the cross into a different message. Love cannot be destroyed. The dominators wanted her to say, "Death ends everything." But the resurrection announced, "Life comes from a deeper source." The rulers wanted her to say, "He who challenges power will be forgotten." But history declared, "He who gave his life for love will be remembered in all generations." That's why we need to take CB careful when imagining that the transformation of the cross occurred just because God decided to transform a bad event into something inspiring. The change is much deeper. The very way in which Jesus went through suffering already began to reveal the defeat of the forces that condemned him. Notice something that many people don't realize. During his mission, Jesus spoke repeatedly about the need not to respond to evil by reproducing evil. This did not mean passivity in the face of injustice. Jesus confronted hypocrisy, reported abuse. He expelled merchants from the temple. He called religious authorities to account. But he refused to let his struggle with darkness turn his heart to darkness. This is one of the most difficult teachings of the gospel. Many people start fighting what they consider wrong and end up becoming similar to what they hated. They begin seeking justice and end up dominated by the desire for revenge. They start by denouncing lies and end up using new lies to win. They start by wanting to protect the weak and end up wanting power over everyone. Jesus did not follow this path. He faced the system without absorbing the spirit of the system. This means that when the powers finally arrested him, they were already defeated in a sense they couldn't yet realize. They could limit his movements, but they did not control his consciousness. They could accuse him, but they did not define his identity. They could mock him, but they could not change his relationship with the Father. They could try to humiliate him, but they could not force him to hate. Jesus' true victory did not begin after the cross. It was already present before inside him. And here is a truth that can transform the way you see your own life. The powers that try to dominate you do not need to control all of your circumstances to win. They just need to control what happens inside you. An external situation can be unfair, but it doesn't have to become your identity. Someone may reject you, but that rejection doesn't have to define your value. A person can lie about you, but their lie doesn't have to determine who you are. You can go through a phase of loss without allowing the loss to destroy your ability to love. This is what Jesus revealed on the cross. The external world seemed to be in the hands of the rulers, but his spirit remained united with the Father. And perhaps it is precisely this union that the Archons did not understand. They believed that Jesus was an isolated unit, an individual who could be separated from his source. They thought that by destroying the body, they would destroy its authority. But Jesus had said that he and the Father were one. This did not just mean a theological phrase. It meant a consciousness of union so deep that no external event could break it. The Archons worked with separation. Jesus lived from unity. They said through fear, "You are alone." Jesus replied, "The Father is with me." They said, "You have been abandoned." Jesus continued to seek his origin beyond appearances. They said, "Your body is all you are." Jesus revealed a life that could not be reduced to matter. They said, "Death ends your existence." Jesus showed that true life was hidden in God. If this message is already awakening something within you, subscribe to the channel now and activate the notification bell. Here we delve into the teachings of Jesus, spiritual mysteries and interpretations that often go unnoticed. And share this video with someone who needs to understand that darkness may seem victorious for a while, but it cannot extinguish the light that comes from the Father. Now we need to enter into an even deeper part of this mystery. If the Archons didn't know exactly who Jesus was, why did they feel such a need to destroy him? Perhaps because the forces of dominance do not always fully understand the light, but they recognize the effect it produces. A dark room does not need to understand the physical nature of light to stop being dark when a flame is lit. Likewise, systems based on ignorance do not need to know the full origin of a spiritual master to realize that his presence is awakening people. Jesus asked questions that broke old certainties. He told parables that remained working within consciousness. Often, he did not provide ready-made answers. He led his listeners to see what was previously hidden. This is dangerous for any power that depends on people incapable of thinking for themselves. A ruler can deal with a rebel who wants to take his place. He can negotiate, arrest, or eliminate this rival. But it's much harder to deal with someone who doesn't want the throne. Jesus did not want to replace Caesar as the new emperor. I didn't want to run the same structures using another name. I didn't want to sit at the top of the pyramid. His message pointed to a transformation of the logic of power itself. When the disciples argued about who was the greatest, Jesus showed that they were still thinking like the world. They still imagined the kingdom of God as a spiritual version of human empires. They believed that Jesus would take power and distribute important positions among them. But Jesus set before them the path of service. This teaching weakens the root of dominance. Archons in many Gnostic interpretations are linked to arrogance. One of them believes he is the supreme authority because he cannot see anything above himself. His prison is not only evil, but blindness. He considers himself the center of everything. It confuses its small territory with the entirety of existence. This image is deeply human. How many people don't live like this too? They know a small part of reality and believe they know everything. They occupy a temporary position and behave as if they were eternal. They receive authority and begin to imagine that authority belongs to their nature. They manage to control some people and conclude that they are invincible. The men who condemned Jesus may have had this same blindness. Pilate believed he had the authority to release or condemn him, but Jesus replied that that authority would not exist if it had not been permitted from above. It was not an attempt to praise Pilate. It was a way of putting him before his own limits. Pilate represented Rome. Before him stood a man without an army, without wealth, and without political protection. In the eyes of the world, the difference in power was absolute. But in spiritual eyes, Pilate was the prisoner. He was tied to his position, his fear of Caesar, his need to maintain order, and the pressure of the crowd. Jesus, even in detention, maintained a freedom that Pilate did not possess. This scene turns everything around. The man on the throne appears free, but he is ruled by the fear of losing the throne. The trapped man seems weak, but he doesn't depend on position to know who he is. The governor asks questions, but cannot recognize the truth before him. Jesus remains silent at times because he realizes that certain answers cannot be understood by those who are still tied to the logic of power. The cross continually reveals these inversions. Whoever seems to win loses. Whoever seems to lose reveals a greater victory. Whoever judges is judged by his own attitude. Anyone who tries to humiliate exposes their own inner poverty. Anyone who believes they are turning off a light ends up showing the entire world how much that light bothers the darkness. Perhaps the Father did not transform the cross into the defeat of the Archons only after the resurrection. Perhaps the cross was already their defeat because it revealed exactly who they were. Until that moment, power could hide its violence behind laws, traditions, speeches, and ceremonies. However, before Jesus, these masks began to fall. A man who healed was accused as a threat. A man who taught love was treated as dangerous. A man who spoke of inner freedom was condemned by structures that claimed to represent God and order. The cross became a mirror, and in this mirror, domain systems see their true face. Even today, when someone uses God's name to justify cruelty, the cross continues to expose this contradiction. When an institution cares more about its reputation than the people it hurts, the cross reveals the problem. When leaders demand sacrifices from others while protecting their own privileges, the cross betrays this logic. When religion forgets mercy and turns guilt into an instrument of control, it approaches the spirit of the Archons again. It is possible to talk about Jesus and still act against everything he taught. It is possible to carry a cross around your neck and continue crucifying people with words. It is possible to frequent sacred places and continue worshiping power. It is possible to know verses and not recognize the light when it appears in someone simple. This is what made the crucifixion possible. Many involved new laws, traditions, and prophecies, but did not recognize the living presence of God. They expected the Father's envoy to fit their expectations. When Jesus did not correspond to the image they had created, they preferred to reject Jesus rather than question their own image. The Archons did not recognize the light because the light did not appear as they expected. They imagined that authority meant visible strength. Jesus appeared with meekness. They imagined that victory meant dominating enemies. Jesus taught how to love. They imagined that greatness meant being above. Jesus knelt to wash feet. They imagined that purity meant staying away from the impure. Jesus approached them. They imagined that God would only reveal himself to those who were important. Jesus saw greatness in fishermen, women, foreigners, children, and people forgotten. It is possible that the Archons' blindness came from their inability to understand a form of power that did not depend on domination. For them, surrender was weakness. Forgiveness was failure. Humility was insignificance. Compassion was vulnerability. Therefore, when Jesus accepted the way of the cross, they imagined that he had been defeated. They did not know that he was revealing a kingdom whose strength could not be measured by their criteria. But we need to ask a difficult question. If Jesus had this union with the Father, why did he allow the crucifixion to happen? Why didn't you escape? Why didn't you use your power to destroy your enemies? Why didn't he call on a celestial force to remove him from that path? This question has been asked in many ways. Some say it all happened to fulfill prophecies. Others emphasize the atonement of sins. Others see the cross as the ultimate revelation of divine love. In the Gnostic reading, the crucifixion can also be understood as a trap for the forces of ignorance. The dominators, believing they were destroying Jesus, ended up causing an event that would reveal their impotence in the face of divine life. However, you need to be careful with the word trap. We are not talking about a God deceiving inferior beings for fun. We are talking about a wisdom that transforms the very actions of darkness into revelation. Archons act according to their nature. They dominate, accuse, divide, and kill. The Father does not need to produce their wickedness. It only allows them, when they act, to expose their limits. Imagine someone trying to put out the sun by raising their hands in front of their eyes. For a few seconds, that person may believe they have overcome the light. You can look around and see only the shadow created by your own hands. But the sun continues to shine. Darkness exists only in the limited field of your perception. The Archons would have made a similar mistake. By crucifying Jesus, they believed they had turned off the light. But they only revealed that their authority reached the body, not the source of life. They managed to create a few hours of darkness, but they didn't touch the place where the light came from. This is an important truth for anyone going through difficult times. There are times when you may feel like everything has been erased. Your plans fall apart. People he trusted abandon him. Doors close. An unfair accusation changes your life. You look around and can only see the shadow. But shadow is not the definitive absence of light. Often it's just something placed temporarily between your eyes and the source. On the Friday of the crucifixion, the disciples only saw the end. They didn't have the vision of Sunday. They did not understand how the Father would transform that situation. Most fled. Others followed from a distance. Some remained close but carried a pain that they could not imagine what would happen next. The Archons believed that the silence of the tomb confirmed their victory. But God's silence does not always mean absence. Sometimes it is the space where a transformation is happening beyond the reach of our eyes. Maybe you are living an inner Saturday. Something has ended, but the new has not yet appeared. You have already experienced loss, but you have not yet seen the resurrection. He has already entered the silence, but has not received a response. In the meantime, the voices of fear say it's over. They say God has moved away. They say darkness won. The story of Jesus asks that you not turn the Sabbath into completion. What looks like a tomb may be holding a revelation. What seems like silence can be preparation. What looks like defeat may be exposing the weakness of the power that tried to destroy you. This does not mean romanticizing pain. Jesus did not teach that suffering is always good. He healed people because illness caused suffering. He fed the hungry because hunger was not a blessing. He freed the oppressed because oppression should not be accepted. The cross does not make all violence sacred. On the contrary, it reveals how far human violence can go when it is combined with fear and the desire for control. The transformative power is not in the cruelty of the cross. It's in the love that wasn't destroyed by her. This distinction is essential. Throughout history, some people have used the cross to convince victims to stay in abusive situations. They said that suffering in silence was imitating Jesus. But Jesus did not seek violence because he believed he deserved to be hurt. He gave his life for a mission and openly confronted what was unfair. His surrender was free, not psychological submission to his abusers. The teaching is not that you must accept all suffering. The teaching is that even when suffering cannot be avoided, it does not need to steal your essence. The cross does not say that violence has value. He says that not even violence could overcome love. The Archons could destroy whoever Jesus stops he could be to externalize, but they could not destroy who he was in the Father. Perhaps this is why the resurrection does not just represent a body coming back to life. It represents the confirmation of an identity that the world tried to deny. The authorities said Jesus was guilty. The Father raised him up. The men said their mission was over. The Father enlarged it. The dominator said he was abandoned. The resurrection showed that the union had not been broken. The stone before the tomb also carries a deep meaning. Powers like rocks, they like stamps, they like closed doors, they like the appearance of control. The stone said, "No one enters and no one leaves." The seal said, "This situation belongs to the authority." The guard said, "The end will be preserved." But the life of God does not ask for authorization from human systems. The stone has been removed. The seal lost its value. The guards were unable to stop what was beyond their understanding, and the place where Jesus was supposed to hide began to announce his absence. "He's not here." What a powerful phrase. The Archons placed it in a defined place. They tried to reduce the light to an enclosed space. However, when the women arrived, the message was that he was no longer where the dominators had placed him. Perhaps this phrase is also addressed to you. You are no longer in the place where they tried to imprison you. You don't need to continue living within the identity that someone imposed. You are not limited to past mistakes. You are not condemned to repeat your family history. You are not just what they did to you. You are not stuck forever in the grave that fear tried to put you in. The resurrection is the declaration that God can call you out of the definitions of the world. But there is something even more surprising. The resurrected Jesus does not return seeking revenge. Think about what a human narrative would normally do. The wronged hero would return with superior strength. He would find those who condemned him. It would show its power. He would punish his enemies. He would prove to everyone that he was right. Jesus does not follow this script. He appears to the disciples. He finds injured and scared people, offers peace, restore Peter, who had denied him. He walks with two disciples who were confused. It shows that the resurrection is not the continuation of the cycle of revenge, but the beginning of a new creation. This may be the final proof that the Archons have been defeated. If Jesus had returned dominated by hatred, they would still have been able to imprint their image on him. If he had used the resurrection to humiliate and destroy, he would have adopted the logic of those who crucified him. But he comes back saying, "Peace." Violence failed to transform it into violence. Abandonment failed to turn him into bitterness. Betrayal failed to transform him into someone incapable of trust. The cross failed to produce in him the spirit of the crucifiers. This is the victory. Sometimes we think that winning means making the enemy suffer what he made us suffer. But spiritually, the greatest victory may be preventing the evil we receive from becoming the evil we transmit. When you break the cycle, something loses power. When someone hurts you, but you choose not to hurt your children in the same way, a chain is broken. When you grow up surrounded by humiliation, but choose to treat other people with dignity, an ancient force is defeated. When someone has tried to destroy your ability to love, but you heal your wounds and learn to love wisely, the cross becomes a resurrection within you. This doesn't happen instantly. Some wounds need time, support, and care. Forgiveness does not mean pretending that nothing happened. It also doesn't mean allowing the person to continue hurting you. It is possible to forgive and set limits. It is possible to abandon the desire for revenge and still seek justice. It is possible to give the weight of hatred to God without returning to the place that almost destroyed your life. Jesus did not return to the cross after being resurrected. He came out of the tomb. This image needs to be remembered. There are people who believe that spirituality means forever reliving one's pain. They return to the place of the wound every day, reconstruct the scene. They feed the accusation. They make suffering their identity. But the cross is a passage, not a home. Jesus crosses the cross, enters the tomb, and comes out of it. He doesn't deny what happened. The marks remain. However, marks no longer mean defeat. They become testimony that the wound did not have the final say. If this video is making you see the cross in a different way, leave a comment. Write, "Light cannot be imprisoned." This phrase can become a statement for your own walk and also help others find this message. Take the opportunity to share the video because there is someone close to you living as if the grave was permanent bone, and perhaps that person needs to hear that the stone can be removed. Now we need to return to the question of the Archons to understand why ignorance is so important in this narrative. In many Gnostic traditions, humanity's fundamental problem is not just sin understood as moral disobedience, it's oblivion. Human beings forgot their origins, lost awareness of the divine spark, and began to identify completely with the outside world. The Archons would maintain this oblivion through distractions, fear, and false identities. They would not need to stop all people from talking about God. It would be enough to allow them to talk about God in a way that would never awaken anyone. A religion based only on appearance can perfectly serve dominance. A spirituality that creates more fear than freedom can strengthen the chains. A teaching that places God always distant can prevent the soul from perceiving his presence. Therefore, Jesus did not just bring religious information. It brought recognition. His words often function as something that awakens an inner memory. When he says that the kingdom of God is near, he breaks the idea of distance. When he talks about light, bread, living water, and seeds, he uses images that touch deep regions of consciousness. When you call God Father, you invite people into a relationship, not just a theory. Archons could deal with theories. Theories can be discussed, controlled, and transformed into institutions. But the inner encounter is more difficult to manage. A person who has had a profound experience with mercy cannot easily be convinced that God is only condemnation. A person who has found peace in the secret will not always depend on religious noise. A person who has seen the light in others will have difficulty accepting speeches that dehumanize entire groups. Jesus awakened this type of consciousness. He didn't just say that the excluded should be respected. He approached them. It didn't just talk about forgiveness. Forgave. Not only did he teach that God took care of the little ones, I placed them in the center. He didn't just criticize hypocrisy. It showed that true purity begins on the inside. Each gesture removed a layer of forgetfulness. It is possible to imagine that the Archons saw the effect of this message and concluded that Jesus needed to be stopped. The more people woke up, the less dominance fear would have. The more people discovered the Father, the less they would depend on structures that commercialized access to the sacred. The more people understood service, the less they would accept leaders who only wanted prestige. Crucifixion would then have been an attempt to preserve oblivion. But the attempt produced the opposite. Before the cross, Jesus was known mainly in a limited region. After the cross and the resurrection, his story crossed borders. The message spread throughout the empire that condemned him. People began to gather in homes. Slaves and free sat together. Men and women received spiritual gifts. Communities emerged in distant cities. Of course, over time, the Christian religion itself was also enveloped by power structures. The name of Jesus was used to justify things contrary to his spirit. The cross that revealed the defeat of domination was sometimes transformed back into an instrument of domination. This is one of the great tragedies of history. The symbol of the one who was condemned by the empire ended up appearing in imperial projects. The message of the one who taught to love your enemies was used in wars. The name of the one who approached the excluded was used to exclude. The story of the one who faced hypocrisy was used to protect hypocritical institutions. This shows that Archons, understood as forces of control and blindness, do not automatically disappear when a person begins to use religious language. They can hide within their own religion. They can transform living faith into a mechanism of fear. They can replace experience with God with blind obedience to human beings. They can use sacred symbols while denying the spirit of those symbols. Perhaps that is why it is so important to always return to Jesus, not just the Jesus presented by institutions, but the Jesus of the Gospels, the man who asked questions, the master who bothered the powerful, the one who saw people where others saw labels, he who preferred mercy to empty sacrifice, one who was not afraid to call out leaders who placed heavy burdens on others. When we look at this Jesus, we realize that his crucifixion was not an accident unrelated to his message. He was condemned because his life revealed another way of existing. The cross was the system's response to a freedom it could not control. But the Father turned this answer into revelation. The Ark yesterday, they said, This is what happens to those who challenge power. The Father replied, "This is how power reveals its weakness." They said, "Death proves that he had no authority." The Father responded, "The resurrection will reveal where his authority came from." They said, "The cross will erase your words." The Father replied, "The cross will make the world ask who he was." They said, "His followers will abandon him." The Father replied, "These followers will still be transformed." This last point is essential. The disciples did not seem prepared to continue the mission. They had fled. Pedro had denied it. Thomas doubted. Others returned to old paths. The crucifixion revealed their fragility. But the resurrection didn't just defeat death. He restored broken people. Jesus did not appear to Peter to humiliate him. "I didn't say I told you you would deny me." He did not expose his failure in front of everyone with pleasure. He asked a simple and profound question, "Do you love me?" Then he gave him back responsibility. This is a form of authority that the Archons do not understand. Common power uses people's failure to keep them submissive. Constantly remember your mistakes. It feeds shame. It says they will never be worthy again. The power of Jesus restores without denying the truth. Pedro needed to recognize his fragility, but he would not be imprisoned by it. The Archons accuse. Jesus restores. Archons reduce you to the worst moment of your life. Jesus sees what you can still become. The Archons say, "You failed, therefore it's over." Jesus says, "You have failed. Now learn to love with more humility." Archons use guilt to paralyze. Jesus turns repentance into a path. It is possible that many people today are living under a spirituality more similar to the voice of the Archons than to the voice of Christ. They wake up every day feeling like God is just waiting for a mistake to condemn them. They pray driven by panic. They serve because they are afraid. They cannot imagine that the Father knows them deeply and still calls them close. Fear may produce outward obedience, but it does not produce true transformation. A terrified child may follow rules as long as the threat is present, but love creates a change that continues even when no one is looking. Jesus taught a justice that is born within the heart. It was not enough to avoid murder while fueling hatred. It was not enough to appear faithful while the desire was uncontrolled. It was not enough to pray in public when the interior only sought approval. He led people from appearance to essence. This transition from the outside to the inside is also a defeat for the Archons. They govern better when human beings live attached to appearances, when everyone cares more about appearing holy than being transformed, when reputation is worth more than the truth, when ritual replaces love, when the opinion of the crowd matters more than the Father's voice in secret. The cross destroys appearance. Jesus does not appear victorious. It doesn't feel protected. It doesn't seem recognized. It doesn't seem honorable. Every outer image of success is removed. What remains? Your confidence, your love, your identity, his union with the Father. Perhaps the cross is the place where everything that is not essential falls. Titles, applause, political protection, human expectations, everything disappears. All that remains is what no one can manufacture. This is why the cross also scares the ego. The ego wants to be seen, confirmed, admired, and protected. He interprets all loss as destruction. But Jesus shows that there is something in us that can survive the collapse of images. This does not mean that everyone has to abandon their lives, families, or projects. It means that none of these things can carry the weight of our identity alone. When you believe it's just your job, losing your job feels like losing your very existence. When you believe that it is just the opinion that others have about you, any criticism becomes devastating. When you believe that your value depends on recognition, you start to live as a servant of the crowd. Archons do not need to chain someone who is completely dependent on approval. Just control the applause. Today they approve, and you feel alive. Tomorrow they reject you, and you feel like you have disappeared. Jesus knew the instability of crowds. At one point they wanted to make him king. In another they called for his conviction. Whoever lives only by public opinion is never free. The same people who offer applause can offer accusations. Jesus did not trust his identity to the reactions of the crowd. He knew who he was before the miracles. I knew who it was during the applause. I knew who I was in the desert. He knew who he was before Pilate. I knew who I was on the cross. This inner continuity reveals the presence of the Father. Circumstances changed, but the source remained. And perhaps this is one of the most urgent messages for our time. We live in a time where many people surrender their identity to the eyes of others. They publish awaiting approval. They constantly compare themselves. They measure their own worth by numbers. One negative word can erase 100 words of affection. Conscience is trapped in a kind of permanent court. Modern archons may not appear with ancient names. They can emerge as algorithms that fuel comparison, speeches that produce fear, leaders who profit from outrage, and systems that transform insecurity into a market. It takes discernment. Not all technology is bad. Not all authority is corrupt. Not every institution is the enemy. The problem begins when something outside takes the place that belongs to the Father. When your mind can no longer rest. When you don't know who you are without the eyes of the crowd. When your peace depends on news, comments, numbers, or validation. So the cross asks a question again. Who defines you? The men said that Jesus was a criminal. The Father called him son. The crowd said he should be rejected. The Father had placed his mission in him. The soldiers saw weakness. Heaven saw faithfulness. The appearance said abandonment. The inner union said something deeper. Which of these voices was true? The cross shows that the world's opinion can be completely different from God's truth. Perhaps today you are carrying a name that did not come from the Father. Someone called you incapable. Someone said it would never be enough. An experience made you believe you were born to fail. A mistake became a label. A rejection turned into identity. These names function as little inner rulers. They tell you what you can and cannot do. Establish limits. They produce fear. You don't always realize you are obeying. Jesus' message is a call to remember his name before the Father. Before beginning his public mission, Jesus heard that he was the beloved Son. Soon after, he was taken to the desert and tempted. Observe the sequence. First, identity. Then, confrontation. The temptation begins by asking, "If you are a son." This strategy still exists. The voice of doubt doesn't necessarily start by asking you to do something terrible. It starts by questioning who you are. If God loves you, why are you going through this? If you have value, why were you rejected? If there is light inside you, why do you still feel afraid? If your life has purpose, why didn't things turn out the way you imagined? Temptation wants to transform circumstances into definition. Jesus does not prove his identity by obeying the tempter's voice. He remains anchored in the word received from the Father. At the cross, the same strategy reappears. If you are the Son, come down. It's a provocation, an attempt to force him to demonstrate who he is according to the rules of his enemies. They want Jesus to prove his identity by using power to save himself. But Jesus does not need to participate in this spectacle. If he came down just to satisfy their demands, he would be allowing his enemies to define the way the Son should act. Remaining did not mean incapacity. It meant refusing the game. How many times do you also enter into games that you should never accept? Someone provokes and you feel like you need to respond. Someone questions your worth and you spend years trying to prove something. Someone compares you and you start running in a direction you didn't even want to go. Archons feed on automatic reactions. Jesus does not react automatically. He discerns. There are times when he speaks and times when he is silent. There are times when he confronts and times when he withdraws. There are times when he answers one question with another. Don't live controlled by other people's expectations. This is spiritual freedom. Being free doesn't mean doing everything you want. It means not being governed by everything you feel. It means creating a space between the provocation and the response. It means asking, where does this voice come from? Where does it want to take me? What will happen to my heart if I obey? The Archons crucified Jesus because they believed he would react according to the logic of the world. If he fought violently, They would be justified in treating him as a rebel. If he abandoned his message, they would prove that fear worked. If he hated them, they would show that everyone was equal when pressured. But Jesus went through the conflict without giving them his essence. And the Father turned this into defeat for them, not a defeat that immediately eliminated all evil in the world. There is still violence. Unfair systems still exist. There are still people dominated by arrogance. The victory of the cross does not mean that history is over. It means the fundamental lie has been exposed. Death is not absolute. Human power is not divine. Violence does not create truth. The accusation does not define identity. Fear does not need to rule. Love has a strength that dominators cannot understand. This revelation spread and continues to challenge each generation. However, it can also be domesticated. We can transform the cross into a decorative object and forget its meaning. We can celebrate the resurrection without leaving our own tombs. We can sing about freedom while still stuck in resentment. Therefore, the question in this video should not just remain in the past. It is not enough to ask whether the Archons crucified Jesus. We need to ask, where does the logic of the Archons continue to try to crucify the light today? It appears when someone is silenced because they reveal an uncomfortable truth. It appears when institutions protect their image instead of protecting people. It appears when religion uses shame to control. It appears when differences are transformed into hatred. It appears when leaders demand worship. It appears when a person needs to make another person smaller to feel big. It appears when fear is used to sell, govern, or manipulate. But it also appears within us. This point is difficult because it is easier to imagine the Archons as just external enemies. It is more comfortable to believe that we are on the side of light, and that all the darkness is in others. However, the disciples themselves showed that the logic of power could emerge among those who walked with Jesus. James and John desired positions of honor. Others felt jealous. Peter tried to stop Jesus from following the path he had chosen. At another time, some wanted to ask for fire on a village that did not receive them. They loved Jesus, but they still carried patterns of dominance. This means that religious closeness does not automatically eliminate ego. It is possible to listen to profound teachings and still desire superiority. It is possible to follow a humble master and continue looking for a throne. It is possible to talk about love and react with destruction when we are rejected. Jesus did not abandon the disciples because of these contradictions. He taught, corrected, and showed another path. Spiritual transformation is precisely the process of recognizing these forces within us and letting the light pass through them. What is the inner archon that tries to govern you the most? Maybe it's fear. Maybe it's the need for control. Maybe it's resentment. Maybe it's the fault. Maybe it's the comparison. Maybe it's spiritual pride, that feeling that you have understood truths that make you superior to others. This last one is especially dangerous in Gnostic studies. Someone can learn ancient words, know hidden texts, talk about archons, monad, plenitude, and divine spark, but remain dominated by arrogance. People who don't know these concepts may begin to despise them. You may believe that you belong to a superior group of awakened people and that everyone else is ignorant. At that moment, gnosis stops being liberating knowledge and becomes fuel for the ego. True light does not make someone feel pleasure in humiliating those who have not yet understood. Jesus did not use knowledge to show off. He adapted his language. He told simple stories. He asked questions. He treated each person according to their needs. Knowledge that does not produce humility may be just another prison. If you discover that the world is ruled by forces of ignorance, but you come to hate everyone around you, something has gone wrong. If you believe you have a divine spark, but do not recognize dignity in others, your understanding is incomplete. If you talk about liberation while controlling people, you're repeating the pattern of the Archons. Jesus didn't just come to reveal secret information. He came to embody a path. The path is recognized by the fruits. More love, more true, more courage, more compassion, more inner freedom, more responsibility. If knowledge produces paranoia, superiority, and constant fear, it needs to be examined. Light can reveal darkness, but it must not turn your mind into a prison full of invisible enemies. The purpose of discernment is to liberate, not to terrify. This observation is important because some people begin to study the Archons and begin to see them in everything. Every difficulty becomes an attack. Every person who disagrees seems like an agent of evil. Life turns into a permanent battle. In this state, fear continues to rule. It just changed its language. Jesus was not obsessed with powers. He recognized his existence, confronted evil and freed people, but kept his eyes on the Father. His consciousness was not centered in darkness. It was centered in the light. You become similar to what you continually behold. When your attention is fixed only on evil, your inner life begins to be organized by the fear of evil. When he contemplates the Father, he finds the strength to cross the darkness without allowing it to become the center. Perhaps the Archon's greatest strategy is to convince people that they are more powerful than they truly are. Fear magnifies the image of the enemy. It makes you believe there is no way out. It makes every chain seem eternal. But the cross and the resurrection put all powers into perspective. They can hurt, but not create life. They can accuse, but not determine the truth. They can close a tomb, but they cannot stop the Father. They can manipulate crowds, but they cannot control an awakened conscience forever. They can produce noise, but they cannot extinguish the voice that is born in secret. This message should not make us reckless. It is necessary to respect the real dangers. Jesus advised his disciples to be prudent. At times he withdrew because they were trying to arrest him. He did not seek unnecessary suffering. Courage is not the absence of wisdom. The cross happened at a time when his mission had reached a turning point. Jesus did not run to his death from the beginning. He walked, taught, healed, and prepared his disciples. The delivery took place within a purpose. This also helps correct another dangerous interpretation. Some people believe that to demonstrate faith they need to reject all protection, help, or planning. But Jesus taught how to discern time. He went through risky situations without surrendering early. Accepting the cross does not mean looking for crosses everywhere. There are sufferings that are part of fidelity. There are sufferings that arise from reckless decisions. There is suffering imposed by abusive people. There are sufferings that can and should be avoided. Spiritual discernment serves to recognize the difference. The defeat of the Archons does not happen when you become a victim of every situation. It happens when you stop being governed by the forces that wish to erase your consciousness. Sometimes that requires staying. In other situations, it requires leaving. Sometimes it requires talking. In others, silence. Sometimes it requires forgiving from a distance. In others, rebuild a relationship. There is no simple formula for all experiences. There is an inner presence that needs to be cultivated. Jesus sought moments of silence and prayer. Before making big decisions, he would withdraw. Before the crucifixion, he went to the garden. There, his humanity appears with intensity. He doesn't treat pain as something light. Don't pretend you don't feel it. He expresses anguish, asks for the cup to pass, but surrenders his will to the Father. This scene shows that courage is not about not being afraid. Courage is not letting fear be your only advisor. Jesus does not cross the cross like an emotionless stone. He goes through like someone who is deeply conscious. Feel the weight. Recognize the difficulty. Seek support from friends even though they fall asleep. Now, decide. The Archons perhaps imagined that human weakness would be enough to break him. But Jesus' humanity was not a flaw in his mission. It was the place where loyalty became real. Obedience without the possibility of pain would not be surrender. A forgiveness without a wound would not be forgiveness. A trust without darkness would not be trust. It is in the garden that the inner victory begins to become visible. Before the soldiers arrive, Jesus has already decided not to abandon the path. The men haven't arrested him yet, but fear can no longer govern their decision. Therefore, every great transformation has a garden before the cross, an interior place where no one applauds, a moment where you decide who you will be when push comes to shove. The visible battle only reveals the invisible decision. Maybe you're trying to overcome certain situations just as they happen. Reacts when provoked. Seek strength when you are already exhausted. But Jesus shows the importance of the secret. Prayer prepares the conscience before confrontation. It is in secret that you learn to recognize the voice of the Father. It is in secret that the opinion of the crowd loses strength. It is in secret that fear can be presented without masks. It is in secret that a decision is born. When the crisis arrives, you don't create a new identity. Normally, it reveals what was being cultivated. If you cultivate resentment, the pressure will make it boil over. If you cultivate comparison, the loss will arouse envy. If you cultivate communion, darkness will find a deeper root. This does not mean that a person of faith will never collapse. The disciples entered. Peter failed. Grace exists precisely because we are fragile. But there is a difference between falling and building a house inside the fall. Jesus restores. The Father transforms. The resurrection shows that God works even with what seems irreparable. The Archons crucified Jesus believing that the mission depended solely on the human capacity of the disciples. By scattering them, they thought they had destroyed the movement. They didn't know that their own weakness would become space for a greater strength. Pedro, who trembled when faced with a question, then spoke publicly. Thomas, who doubted, became a witness. The hidden disciples came out. The fear did not disappear because they became naturally brave. Something had changed in their understanding. The resurrection placed death elsewhere. When what you fear most stops being absolute, many chains fall off. This is one of the reasons why the empire could not understand the early Christians. Some people preferred to lose position and security, rather than deny what they had recognized. They did not seek death, but they also did not accept that the fear of death was the master of conscience. An empire based on threats faces a problem when it encounters people who cannot be bought by comfort or controlled by terror. But we must again be honest. Over the centuries, Christians have also come to control others through fear of death and damnation. The announcement of liberation became, in some hands, a threat. Hell was used not as a spiritual warning, but as a psychological instrument. People were taught to fear religious leaders more than to seek the Father. At this point, the Archons' logic returned, using the name of the one who defeated them. This is one of the reasons why discernment needs to stay alive. No institution, tradition, or person should be placed above truth, love, and conscience before God. This does not mean rejecting the entire community. The community can care, teach, and strengthen. But no healthy community requires you to abandon your ability to think. Jesus made his listeners think. He asked, "What do you read? How do you understand?" He told stories without immediately explaining all the details. He called people to discern by the fruits. Faith was not presented as a disconnection from conscience. It was an awakening. Archons need obedience without understanding. Jesus desires conscious transformation. They say, "Don't ask." Jesus asks, "What are you looking for?" They say, "Follow because we have authority." Jesus says, "Recognize the truth by its fruits." They say, "God is only with us." Jesus finds faith in outsiders. They build walls. Jesus crosses borders. Perhaps the Archons believed that the cross would raise a definitive wall between Jesus and humanity, but it became a bridge. People who had never walked the roads of Galilee began to feel reached by the message. Distant generations looked at that story and recognized their own pain. The cross has this capacity because it brings together universal experiences: rejection, injustice, abandonment, pain, silence, death. Almost everyone, at some level, knows one of these realities, but the cross does not end with them. Therefore, wounded people find identification in it and hopeful people find transformation. Jesus does not observe human suffering from a distance. Get in it. The Father does not respond to pain with explanations alone. Respond with presence. This is perhaps another aspect that the Archons did not understand. They imagined that God would remain distant. Their logic depended on an absolute separation between the high and the low, the divine and the human, the sacred and the common. But in Jesus, the divine enters the human experience. The Father does not turn the cross into their defeat just by removing Jesus from death. Transform it by showing that there is no place of suffering where your presence cannot reach. Humiliation is not out of reach. Abandonment is not out of reach. Injustice is not out of reach. The tomb is not out of reach. If God can be found even on the cross, where can the Archons build a territory completely separate from the light? They dominate through the idea of absence. They say to the soul, God is not here, but the cross responds, He has entered this far. This does not mean that all suffering automatically reveals God. There are pains that confuse, revolt, and silence. However, the Christian message states that no place is impossible for the divine presence. Maybe you still can't see what God will do with your story. The disciples didn't see it either. Perhaps you are still faced with unanswered questions. Faith does not require you to invent an explanation. It only demands that you not hand over to darkness the right to write the last chapter before the Father finishes His work. Some transformations will be visible in this life. Others will remain a mystery. Not every loss will be compensated in the way we hope. Not every injustice will be corrected immediately. The resurrection message is not a superficial promise that everything will be easy. It is an assertion that visible reality does not contain the whole truth. Archons work only with what they can touch, measure, and control. That's why they don't understand the invisible source. They look at a body in the grave and conclude that everything is over. They look at a buried seed and see disappearance, but Jesus precisely used the seed as an image. The seed falls to the ground and appears to lose its shape. But there is a hidden life in her. What seems like an end is transformation to the. This image should not be applied irresponsibly to any tragedy, but it helps to understand the logic of the resurrection. Divine life is not tied to its current form. It can cut through loss and emerge in ways that dominators do not anticipate. The Archons were experts in conserving forms, thrones, hierarchies, rules, borders. Jesus spoke of new wine, new wineskins, seeds, and birth. He talked about movement. Power wants to freeze. Life transforms. Power wants to possess. Life circulates. Power wants to place God within controllable structures. Jesus says that the Spirit blows wherever it wants. Maybe that's why religious systems have so much difficulty with the Spirit. It is possible to manage buildings, positions, and rituals, but the Spirit can touch someone outside the structure. It can give a voice to an unlikely person. It can awaken truth where no one expected it. The Archons didn't just crucify Jesus. They tried to crucify this freedom. But the Spirit did not remain in the tomb. After the resurrection, the presence that seemed concentrated in Jesus began to manifest itself in the community. The mission did not end with his visible departure. It multiplied. This is another strategic defeat for the dominators. While Jesus was physically in one place, they could try to surround him. Afterwards, his message became impossible to locate in a single body. He began to live among scattered people. It was like trying to put out a flame and discovering that the sparks had lit thousands of others. But these flames were not supposed to create new empires. They should become light in the world. When the Christian community forgets this and seeks domination, it abandons the standard of Jesus. The goal is not to replace the ancient Archons with religious rulers who use the name of Christ. The mission is to reveal another form of life. Serve without controlling. Teach without enslaving. Correct without humiliating. Lead without turning people into property. Have convictions without dehumanizing those who disagree. Seek the truth without losing love. This is the silent revolution of the cross. Maybe she seems slow. Mastery usually produces quick results. A threat can make hundreds comply within minutes. Love takes time. Respect processes. Invite instead of oblige. Therefore, the power of the world seems more efficient. But what is born from fear needs constant fear to continue. When the threat disappears, obedience disappears. What is born from love takes root. Archons build prisons. The Father plants seeds. An arrest can be lifted quickly. A tree needs time. But when it grows, it offers shade, food, and new seeds. The cross looked like a prison structure. Wood, nails, soldiers, and authority. However, the Father placed in her a seed that would last through the centuries. This also changes our understanding of success. Maybe you're doing something real, but you still don't see great results. The world teaches that what does not grow quickly has no value. Jesus teaches through the mustard seed. The kingdom starts small. The Archons are attracted to the spectacle because the spectacle keeps their eyes fixed on the outside. The Father often works in secret. A conversation changes a life. A gesture of mercy interrupts a chain. A person decides not to repeat the violence they received. A family learns another way to love. An awakened conscience. It doesn't appear in the big advertisements, but the kingdom grows. The cross was public, but the resurrection began without a crowd. There was no ceremony organized by the authorities. The first witnesses found the tomb empty in the early hours of the day. The most important transformation in Christian history took place outside the spectacle of power. Archons looked at palaces. God worked in a garden. They watched the centers of authority. The news began with women who society often took for granted as witnesses. This is also an inversion. The Father chooses those the system ignores, not because those excluded are automatically perfect, but because their choice reveals that the kingdom does not depend on prestige criteria. The powerful did not control the resurrection narrative. People considered small became bearers of the news. This pattern runs through the entire story of Jesus. He is born into humble circumstances. It grows far from the political center. Choose ordinary disciples. Find people on the sidelines. It tells stories in which foreigners show compassion and humble people are exalted. Archons think in pyramids. Jesus thinks about tables. In the pyramid, few are at the top and many bear the weight. At the table, different people can sit together. The Last Supper becomes a symbol of this community. Jesus is at the center, but he serves. Break the bread. Share. Even Judas participates in the environment before leaving. The presence of betrayal does not destroy the decision to love. Afterwards, Jesus washes his feet. The master takes the position of the servant. This isn't just a lesson in kindness. It is an exposition of the logic of the kingdom. True authority is not proven by putting others down. It manifests itself in the ability to serve without losing dignity. Archons do not understand this language. For them, going down is losing. For Jesus, descending for love reveals greatness. The cross is the extreme point of this movement. He goes down to the place of the damned. Enter into shame. Share the fate of those who suffer. And in doing so, it takes away the monopoly on meaning from the dominators. They can no longer say that the condemned is necessarily abandoned by God, because the Son was placed among the condemned. They cannot say that humiliation proves the absence of value, because Jesus went through humiliation. They cannot say that public failure defines truth, because the apparently failed man has become the center of faith for millions. The cross changes the meaning of low places. This does not transform injustice into justice, but it prevents injustice from defining the value of the victim. This is one of the biggest blows against the logic of the Archons. They depend on the belief that social position reveals spiritual value. Whoever is above would be more important. Those below should accept that they are worth less. Jesus destroys this equivalence. A poor person can be closer to the kingdom than a rich person. A widow can offer more than powerful people. A child can teach adults. A Samaritan can show more love than religious authorities. A scorned woman can recognize what others do not recognize. A convicted person may be closer to the truth than the judge. So when the Archons place Jesus at his lowest point, they believe they are defining his value, but they only reveal that their criteria were wrong. The Father does not need to place Jesus on Caesar's throne to prove that he is king. Christ's royalty does not belong to the same category. He reigns without becoming similar to rulers. This is why the image of the victorious Christ needs to be understood carefully. Your victory is not authorization for your followers to dominate other people. If someone uses Jesus' victory to justify arrogance, they have not understood the cross. The Lamb wins by remaining Lamb. He doesn't transform into a beast to defeat the beast. This image appears powerfully in Revelation. The world expects a common conqueror, but sees a lamb. Divine victory does not copy the enemy's methods. This also answers the question of why Jesus did not destroy the Archons with violence. If it did so using the same logic as theirs, it would confirm that dominance was the highest form of power. Instead, it reveals a different authority. Light does not need to become darkness to overcome darkness. It just needs to remain light. This sounds simple, but it is extremely difficult. When someone hurts us, there is an almost automatic temptation to respond using the same weapons. If they lied, we want to lie better. If they humiliated themselves, we want to humiliate them. If they excluded, we want to create another group that excludes. The cross interrupts this reflex. Jesus does not accept the enemy choosing his weapons. This is perhaps one of the most practical applications of this entire mystery. Every time someone provokes you, they are offering you a weapon. Anger offers destructive words. Pride offers contempt. Fear offers escape. Revenge offers a momentary feeling of power. You are not obliged to accept. Can recognize emotion without obeying immediately. You can walk away. You can seek help. You can set limits. You can respond later. You can choose a form of action that protects the truth without destroying your own peace. This is not weakness. It's internal government. Archons govern those who do not govern their own reaction. Jesus manifests a kingdom that begins within, a place where the Father is recognized as source. When this center is firm, the external world loses part of its ability to control. Don't lose it all. We remain vulnerable. We need community, laws, protection, and care. But there is a freedom that no structure can completely deliver or take away. This freedom is not isolation. Some people confuse spiritual autonomy with contempt for everyone. They say they don't need anyone, that they have God within them, and that every relationship is a prison. This can also be an ego trap. Jesus cultivated solitude but also communion. He retired to pray and returned to the people. He had disciples. He accepted hospitality. I cried with friends, shared meals. Inner light does not eliminate the need for others. It helps you to relate without turning the other into an idol or property. Archons work through both dependence and isolation. At one extreme, someone surrenders all consciousness to another person. In the other, he becomes unable to trust and believes that he will only survive alone. Jesus shows a third ira via union without loss of identity. He and the Father are one, but Jesus does not stop being who he is. The disciples form one body, but they have different gifts. Love unites without erasing. Dominion unites through uniformity. It requires everyone to think, speak, and act the same way. The unity of the Spirit allows for diversity. This is important for religious communities. A healthy church does not turn people into copies of the leader. Help each one to mature before God. A true master does not want eternally dependent followers. He wants them to grow. Jesus told the disciples that they would do works and continue the mission. He did not center everything on his physical presence. He prepared them to receive the Spirit. Archons accumulate power. Jesus distributes. They hide knowledge to maintain superiority. Jesus teaches, sends, and trusts. They create dependence. Jesus calls friends. This distribution of authority also explains why the cross did not end the mission. The disciples were not just spectators of an extraordinary master. They were called to embody the path. This includes you. It is not enough to admire Jesus for having defeated the forces of domination. You need to ask where your life can manifest this victory. When you tell the truth without cruelty, something of the cross comes alive. When you refuse to participate in an injustice even though you lose an advantage, something of the cross manifests itself. When you use authority to protect, not exploit, something of the kingdom appears. When you welcome someone who has been humiliated, you challenge the system that thrives on exclusion. When he seeks healing instead of transmitting the wound, he turns a small cross into a resurrection. It is not necessary to do great things in front of the world. The kingdom begins in the hidden. A mother who decides to raise her children with more respect than she received. A father who recognizes his mistake and asks for forgiveness. A young man who refuses to humiliate someone to be accepted by the group. A person who reports abuse wisely. Someone who learns to say no without hate. Someone who once again believes they have value. These attitudes seem small, but they weaken the inner structures of the domain. Archons don't just exist in palaces. They want to build little thrones inside every heart. The throne of pride, the throne of fear, the throne of the need to always be right, the throne of resentment. Jesus does not invade these thrones by force. It calls you to deliver them. This surrender can be painful. The ego believes that it will die if it abandons certain defenses. Sometimes a person has been using anger for so long that they don't know who they will be without it. Use control so as not to feel vulnerable. Uses superiority to hide insecurity. The inner cross involves letting die identities that no longer produce life, but we again need to avoid exaggerations. It's not about erasing your personality. God does not want to transform you into someone without will. Jesus had identity, emotions, and limits. The death of the ego means the death of false centrality, not the destruction of the person. You continue to have a voice, you can still disagree. Keep having dreams. Keep setting limits. The difference is that these things are no longer governed by the fear of disappearing. The resurrection does not erase Jesus. Reveal it more fully. Likewise, spiritual transformation does not destroy who you are. Remove what prevented your truth from flourishing. Perhaps the Archons thought that by destroying Jesus' human form, they would prevent his manifestation. But Father showed that true identity did not depend on how they could play. This brings us to one of the deepest mysteries, the cross as a revelation of the divine spark. Some Gnostic traditions stated that there is something in the human being that belongs to higher reality, a light trapped or forgotten within matter. The path to salvation would involve awakening this light and returning to fullness. Traditional Christianity does not always describe humanity with this same language, but it also affirms that humans were created in the image of God and called to communion. The two views are not identical, but they meet in the idea that our deepest truth cannot be reduced to the forces of the world. On the cross, Jesus' body is placed under the control of the authorities, but its origin remains in the Father. The Archons are able to touch the outer layer, but they do not understand the inner reality. Perhaps they crucified the form without recognizing the light. This does not mean despising the body. Jesus healed bodies, fed people, and was resurrected bodily in the Christian narrative. The body is not simply an enemy. The problem is believing that it exhausts all identity. When you reduce yourself to appearance alone, you become vulnerable to every system that sells appearance. When you believe that getting older reduces your value, you start to fight time as your enemy. When you constantly compare your body, you give your peace away impossible obstacles. Inner light does not eliminate taking care of your body. It puts the body in a healthier relationship. It becomes an expression of life, not an absolute measure of value. Archons love external measurements. Who owns more? Who looks better? Who occupies a superior position? Who gets the most attention? Jesus looks at the heart. This does not mean that the interior justifies everything. A person can claim to have good intentions while their actions hurt. Jesus also taught by fruits. Interior and exterior must find coherence, but the transformation begins at the source. If the root is diseased, painting the leaves will not save the tree. Much of the dominator's religion focuses on painting leaves. Behaviors are modified by pressure, but the heart remains full of fear. One learns to appear correct, not to become truthful. Jesus goes to the root. Ask what you love. Ask where your treasure is. Ask why you want to be seen. Ask what comes from the heart. Ask who you say he is. These questions cannot be answered with ritual alone. It is possible that the cross was also necessary, because humanity needed to see the extreme result of an untransformed consciousness. When fear, political power, religious interest, and collective manipulation come together, the innocent can be condemned, while everyone believes they are defending something important. Pilate defends stability. Leaders defend their authority. Soldiers follow orders. The crowd reacts to the moment. Each person has a justification. In the end, Jesus is on the cross. This pattern has been repeated many times in history. Great injustices rarely happen just because one person decided to be bad. They happen because thousands accept small justifications. I'm just following orders. Everyone does. It is necessary to maintain peace. This person represents danger. It's not my responsibility. Archons rule through the fragmentation of responsibility. Everyone participates a little and no one feels like they did everything. Thus, collective consciousness produces something that perhaps no isolated individual would assume. The cross exposes this mechanism. Therefore, contemplating it should make us more careful with our small participations. A shared lie. A humiliation treated as a joke. A prejudice accepted so as not to lose approval. An injustice ignored because it does not affect us. Not everyone holds the hammer, but many help build the cross. This sentence is harsh but necessary. We cannot use the Archon narrative to just place all the blame on invisible forces. Human beings made choices. Spiritual language does not eliminate historical responsibility. Rome crucified. Leaders accused. Disciples abandoned. The crowd participated. Every layer matters. In the same way, today we cannot attribute everything to energies or entities and forget about concrete decisions. If a structure is unfair, people maintain it. If a community abuses, someone chooses to remain silent. If a lie spreads, individuals share it. Spiritual discernment without practical responsibility becomes escape. Jesus united the two. He prayed and acted. He spoke about the kingdom and fed people. It expelled spiritual forces and restored people to the community. He confronted sin and faced hypocritical structures. The victory over the Archons is not just an invisible battle carried out through secret words. It manifests itself in real choices. Choose the truth. Protect the vulnerable. Refuse corruption. Ask for forgiveness. Refund when necessary. Share resources. Don't turn people into objects. These actions create space for the kingdom. Perhaps someone will say, but this seems small in the face of such great powers. The disciples were also small before Rome. Jesus was a man from Galilee facing the empire, but the truth doesn't have to start big. Archons confuse size with strength. The Father uses seeds. A true idea can survive a palace. A gesture of courage can awaken a community. A coherent life can reveal the lie of an entire system. That's what happened to Jesus. Its existence made visible the distance between what authorities claim to represent and what they actually did. The more they tried to silence him, the more they exposed that distance. The cross is the ultimate contradiction. Leaders claim to protect God but condemn those who show mercy. Rome claims to protect order, but uses extreme violence against someone who did not lead an army.